cloud.
Okay.
There it is. Okay. Now back to my sharing. Okay, there we go. Okay, so talking about how we're influenced in beliefs and embedded beliefs in infancy, things we don't identify necessarily, but they've been modeled to us, and so they're embedded inside of us. But as the influences expand in childhood, friends come into play, coaches, teachers. I think this is usually where religion starts to have more influence. We may be taken to church, but at this point, we were able to be taught stories and belief systems about who God is and how God may be the same or different as our parents. One thing I was reading in Moral Injury is that we tend to choose a religion that reinforces our dysfunction. It's not a very encouraging thought, but the idea is that we tend to put our dysfunction or the way we view life, and we want to add God to that. So we go to a church that reinforces that. Like my dad had very strong rules, very strong discipline, and we found churches that had strong leaders, strong rules, strong discipline, and so it all fit. And so those influences begin to expand. Our culture is another thing, where you were born and how like I was born in North Carolina. So that means I was born a Baptist, I was born a Christian. Sorry if you were born in North Carolina and aren't a Baptist, forgive me, but that was me. I was born a Baptist, a Christian, a little bit racist, a whole kind of history that was passed down to me. So culture influences that. And then we get to adolescence, and adolescence is an interesting scenario because that's when I rebelled. Like I couldn't please my dad. It didn't matter what I did. So why bother? So I actually went after the things that he made rules against and thought, well, there might be something there. I'll figure those out. They called that my rebellious years. I called it that for a long time until I got with a mentor who said, yeah, but wait a minute. What if this is you having the influence of your parents and then compared or contrasted with the influence of others in your childhood and saying, I kind of like what was happening in my friend's house, the way his parents treated them, I'm going to try that on and go different than my parents. And so I think that was a large part of what adolescence was for me. In my situation here at the VA, then military usually comes in after adolescence. And the military deconstructs all of that came before. Military has values. Every branch has their own stated values. But they have to break down civilian interpretation of those values and make them a military kind of brand that creates killers who can kill with an instinct rather than trying to make a value judgment as to whether that person deserves to die or not. And so now you get that put into the mix. And then at the end of their military assignment, they pat them on the butt, thanks for your service, and now send them back home and good luck. Then you have adulthood, which is this integration. How do I integrate all of my experiences into my meaning? What do I believe about a design and a designer? My purpose. How am I connected to that design and to that designer? And community. And those are our influences that I think that we come up with. The thing is about this is that what we often don't do is go back to reconsider our meaning, purpose, and hope at each stage of our life or after all those experiences in our lives. And so we're working off of a childlike faith within experiences that don't match or don't get explained by that childlike faith. And that's where I think if we understand that the patients that we're seeing probably are still working off of childlike faith, or one that at least doesn't cover the trauma that they're in right now, Now we have something to start working with. And, the more I understand their context, their history, their background, the better I can understand. So what's the trauma and how are you integrating those? Or have you even thought about that? So what then is the impact of trauma? And I think it's a challenge to our belief system, but how does that work? Richard Rohr, in his book on Falling Upward, talks about, he says, after 30, most of the learning that happens in us happens from failure, or I would put trauma. So we don't learn by how we learned the way we grew up. Hey, you're good at this, and reinforcement. And he calls this kind of a sort of a narcissism of encouragement and support and that kind of thing. And after 30, it's really more of failure. We're learning from ourselves. Nobody's trying to direct us. It's kind of an every man for himself in some sense. So what's the impact of trauma on belief system? And this is where I was reading a journal article about, it just got sent out in Transforming Chaplaincy, and spiritual pain, a symptom in search of a clinical definition. And it describes spiritual pain as a disruption in the principle which pervades a person's entire being, which I would say is spirituality, meaning, purpose, and hope, and which integrates and transcends one's biological nature. So in other words, spiritual pain is the thing that calls into question our belief system. So would you agree that most of the people that you visit in the hospital room or in therapy that are in some kind of level of trauma, how do you react to that statement? Anybody?
Tim, as I'm thinking about this, first, most of the trauma that I experienced, I was like 2 years to 5 years old to 10 years old. So I'm one of those ones where chronic trauma formed my brain. So, at a very early age. And so in my 30s is when I started having like panic attacks related to that childhood stuff. So in my 40s, I'm doing my most learning. And 50s, my 40s and 50s, I'm doing my most learning. So my perception's going to be a little different than maybe somebody whose traumas were later in life. But I definitely think that traumas totally disrupt somebody's life and their being and all of their beliefs and kind of flips it and turns it on their head. But there's also cases where everything got turned on their head at a young age, and whatever they're going through as an adult is either playing into that same mindset, making it worse, or they're triggering stuff, you know what I mean? Or the disruption could be the current trauma, or the disruption could be the how it relates to their past, and if they are in conflict or if they fold in together. I don't know. It's very complicated.
Yeah, but succinctly said. Thanks. It's that idea they say in grief that when a grief happens, all the past grief comes back to visit. So if, like you say, you were formed in kind of these traumatic events early on in life, and that's the filter now that you interpret life and relationships from, grief comes in or trauma comes in, and it's like, see, just goes to show, and I was actually talking to my son about this last night. He broke up in a relationship with a girl. Actually, she dumped him. So just be real about that. And so now we were talking about, all right, so what's that telling you? Because he's having a really hard time with that. What's the message you're listening to? What's that? What are you hearing? Like, well, I'm not worth it. She loved me. That felt really good. And now she doesn't. That feels really bad. It's like I'm always clinging to that, trying to get her back. Well, if that's the filter he's interpreting everything by, maybe it's time to re-examine that message. Well, yeah, I appreciate that, Jimmy. So let's talk about religious preference. If I go into a room and look at their religious preference and say, okay, well, I know where they're coming from. Do we really? Like, what's your experience with patients' religious preferences, and how seriously do you take that in a visit with them?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
Half the time, I don't even trust what the census says.
Yeah, there's that.
But you know, it's interesting because we have a case right now on the floor where their religious preference is non-religious, secular, and they just got some really bad news. And so, in most times, I don't really take it. You know what I mean? I take it with a grain of salt. But with that one, I thought, well, maybe I'll wait before I go in there, just in case that's, you know what I mean? I'd rather be cautious than completely throw it out. So I'll kind of use it as a guide, but be open to the fact it may be different once I get in the room.
Yeah.
I think if I were honest, I would have to say that because of, you know, I came into chaplaincy later, and when I came in and took my training and jumped into the work, I think I took religious preference pretty seriously, because that was kind of the way I felt I was trained. Now, maybe I wasn't really trained that way. That's through the filters that I took it in. I think I took it fairly seriously in terms of at least what not to do. Maybe not so much what to do, but you know, but what not to do.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay.
I found that in Bozeman, a lot of people put agnostic or none or even atheist down, and then you didn't really know what their spirituality was. And when I talked with Ed Staffman, and he told me that half of his congregation at Beth Shalom were atheists, I thought, well, that's interesting. So they follow a cultural, traditional sort of spirituality, but they were atheists. And then I realized that Buddhists, many of them do not believe in God. So a Buddhist could be atheist or agnostic on the religious census, and then be definitely spiritual, but just not owning up to it. So anyway, that can happen.
Sounds like it's more confusing than helpful. So one of the things that I've discovered in to your point, Ken, Native Americans would not define themselves as religious, but spiritual, deeply spiritual. In our context, like Kelly and I, with working with vets, one of the things is that they had to declare their preference when they went into the service at 17, 18 years old. And a lot of the guys and women that I talk to about that, I got you listed as this, and they'll say, yeah, I had to come up with something. Didn't know exactly what to do. So they came up with how they were raised, or their friend was that, and they liked their friend. So, but then the question is, so how is that helping you right now in where you're at? So somebody will come into treatment and just about killing themselves with alcohol or PTSD or moral injury is just stifling them. They're stuck on that. That's their stuck point. And they'll come in and bring their religious history back with them. But the thing that I'll ask them is, so how is that helping you? Well, it's giving me more guilt. Okay, that's not helpful, right? So what is that about your faith that you want to pursue, and what is that? Maybe is it guilt? Is it forgiveness? Is it that shame? And that again is bringing that that child faith that I had embedded in me early on into adult faith through my traumas. How do I answer the question of my trauma and my experience with that? And if I can't, I may call myself that, but it's not answering my questions. So that's where I think that's in thinking about these stages of faith might be helpful in giving us a little idea of where they came from, because that probably informs their conscience. Their conscience came from that. Even though they walked away from it, their conscience still was informed, maybe embedded by that value system. So here's what I've started to do with the stages of faith, because this has become something that's been very helpful to me. And this comes from a guy named Fowler, James Fowler, I believe. I'm going to change my screen so I can show you. Okay, so do you see Fowler's stages of faith development on your screen?
Yes.
Okay, I just made it larger. So this is James Fowler is American theologian, died in 2015, professor of theology and human development at Emory, minister at a United Methodist Church, wrote about stages of faith and development in a book titled Stages of Faith, Psychology of Human Development and Quest for Meaning. So what he did was he started with these stages, like he started with the intuitive projective. He actually started at 0-2 for this preliminary stage of faith and influence. But children will assimilate to the faith they see from their parents. And so this is the idea of just saying a child who folds their hands before a meal in preparation for the prayer that is said and has been said since they were an infant, doesn't really think about it. A prayer I was taught early on, now I lay me down to sleep. I prayed the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake. It's like, that's weird as a kid to think about. I'm praying that every night. I pray the Lord my soul to take. Well, I didn't even know what that was, but it just was kind of embedded. It's just kind of, it's how we do things, and I just accept it without thought. The way it is in my house is the way that it is, and therefore it's the way it is in my house is different from the way it is in your house. So the way it is in my house is right, and the way it is in your house is wrong. That's how a child thinks. Stage 2 talks about this, accepting language that's symbolic and analogies, doesn't grasp intention or symbols and analogies. So somebody's taught the story of David and Goliath. Okay, small boy defeats a large giant. Now, was there really a giant that was about 10 feet tall? And well, yeah, of course there was, and he lost. And Israel, because they had God, they won. So any nation other than Israel loses, and David, the new king of Israel, wins. So it's kind of like this literal. This is just the way it is. And then it goes on to stage 3, which this is the idea that most people stay at this stage. Conforms to the ideals and actions of the group they're in and can perceive abstract thoughts. But at this point, they can determine difference between their beliefs and a group's beliefs, individual there and the group. The group's beliefs influence their personal beliefs. Adults who have a strong peer influence on them may remain at this stage. I mean, we build this insulated culture of our belief system, and then God becomes a confidant. And this is going back, he was influenced by Piaget on this, also Erickson. So that's stage 3. Stage 4 mid-20s to 30s, like this is college and early adulthood. Focus on commitments and beliefs, more complex thoughts. In other words, the mind has developed to a point that it can reason and logically say, now, wait a minute. You know, Genesis 1, in a day, God created 6 days, God created the heavens and the earth. I'm going to a university where they're talking about evolution. That makes sense to me. That the other one doesn't. So now my biology professor is challenging that, and I don't know what to do with that. And so they're able to reason a little bit at this stage. And this is a time that doubt comes in and questions come in. And then you get to stage 5, and this is midlife. And then you start thinking about personally, who am I and where am I? A trauma comes in at this stage, and you begin to say, okay, I appreciate like my religious rituals and symbols and some of the deep things that I get there, but I've got some questions. And then stage 6, and this is like Fowler would say, very few people actually get to this. And I don't know that the goal is that we walk through all of these stages or that they're linear, but the ultimate stage of spiritual growth, it's an enlightenment. It's marked by deep understanding and compassion. It doesn't have a problem with symbolism and metaphor rather than literalism. One of the things, if I could move back here to that PowerPoint. This chart helps me because like stage 1 is trust versus mistrust. The favorable outcome, if I get a positive example, as I have faith in the environment, future events, that's kind of my filter I see life through. If it's a dysfunctional one, like Jenny was talking about, I'm suspicious. I fear future events because present isn't safe. I can't look to the future. The second, autonomy versus doubt, is a sense of self-control and adequacy is a positive thing. Negatively, feelings of shame and self-doubt. You see how this can actually, the progression, the ability to progress stops with trauma or abuse, or like mental health talks about ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. As they build up, it makes it very difficult to develop, not only in our physical, mental development, but also spiritual. So favorable outcome in that third stage is ability to be a self-starter, to initiate one's activities. Negative would be a sense of guilt, inadequacy to be on one's own. So this is just kind of the idea. What I wanted to expose you to is get a little bit into my head of some things that I'm processing myself in this idea of why do I have questions, and why have those questions been building? And then when trauma comes, and for me, that was a divorce, and then going through the death of my dad, who was that was really a more important issue to me. That feels bad even saying, but it was, because I felt like it was developmental to why the divorce was so debilitating to me. Like I took it so personally, I'm a total failure. And wait a minute, where did that come from? And these kind of things help me understand, well, I see where they came from. Is there a way to escape that? I just had a veteran in my office this morning who came from a very abusive childhood, and was actually kicked out of the military because he wanted to go there for a head start, but he was trained to filter every experience. Like in basic training, if the guy training him looked like he was mad at him, he took it personally. Well, of course he looks like he's mad. That's the only way they train, so he couldn't get past that. And now he's trying to go into recovery, and instead of just saying our goal here is for you to get sober or to get over the PTSD, the goal is to go after where's the message coming from so you can change it. Okay. me stop there and just ask you any questions or comments, or how you would see this helping you in the way that you deal with patients in your work as chaplain. Oh, wow, you had a close-up of me this whole time? I'm gonna pull this back out.
It just magically zoomed in not that long ago. Just wanted to see you up
When I
close.
get real expressive, the camera takes that as like, oh, poignant moment. Let's move in on him. And that's one of those. And that's
It
why.
was very dramatic. It
Yeah,
was.
thank you.
Uh-huh.
And I have to do, the camera is made in China, so you have to do the L to make it zoom in or out. And they're kind of over there snickering, saying, see, they're calling everybody a loser. So back to my question. How does that strike you?
I used stages of development, Piaget, psychological development, educational development all the time, because I think it's key to many of the things. But I think that's why it's so important to get a background. I mean, going back even to the religious preference. I mean, really, does anyone just have one anymore? Not very many people.
Yeah.
Because it goes back, you have to, I think all of that has played into who the person is today. All of that prior knowledge, all of that development is key. And helping people to unpack some of that, I think, is very much part of their spiritual healing and their spiritual development, their faith development, that we can play into in a small part in the time that we have with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even to expose it. And what if they married somebody of a completely different faith or nationality? And, how does that conflict move into it? An interesting thing about this is that most chaplains, and that means you, so sorry, not most, many chaplains that I talk to also are going through their own crisis of faith, and tend to be older. Older is anybody older than me? No, that's old. Old is anybody older than me. And everybody's older here. So is that as much something that would be helpful for us to see that we're in a stage of faith rather than this doubt that tends to connect us more to guilt, maybe even shame, rather than understanding, no, this is maybe a developmental stage that I actually have to go through and ask some of these hard questions. Is that, you identify with that?
You're asking a lot of tough questions.
Is that why nobody's
so like when we're looking at that last slide, not the last one, but the one before last, was it Peterson's? That one, Erickson's. So like if I look back on me and all those years, it's like unfavorable outcome in all of those categories would describe me.
Yeah.
Until I got into my latter years, and now things have started to shift to the other side. And so if you think of all those layers, right, when somebody's forced with a trauma, we see them as patients, they could be any one of those layers, right? Or I find myself just having conversation and looking for any of these things in any of these boxes that pop up. Yeah. And if it's positive things, and trying to reinforce those. If they're negative things, and I'm kind of like, okay, well, you know, what was the cause of that, and not explore that with them, but just say, okay, if they're having feelings of shame and self-doubt right now, and they're going through this trauma, how can I find one of these positive things that they've talked about and try and reinforce it? But I don't think there's anything that's really linear, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and we're only as good as we've experienced, right? So even if I think that I've already been through the dark night of the soul and I've worked it out and I'm feeling a lot more confident in my faith, it's only because I've only been tested as far as I've been tested. You know what I mean? Tomorrow could be a whole other thing that would take you to a whole nother level.
It's interesting, like what is your capacity to be challenged in your thinking? And Richard Rohr and some of the research that's been done says you only have a capacity to challenge about 5% of your belief system at a time.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, baby steps. That's why I like this slide about this process of growth and in faith. And then there's this, I start moving over to the doubt stage in stage 4, but for many, it gets too scary. Like I'm losing, if it's, let's say you're LDS and the faith system isn't just personal belief, it's also family, it's also community, it's also my job. You know, it's so interconnected with so many things. And so am I ready for that? Even though I have, if I would be authentic, I really have some questions. Or even drop out, like it talks about. Well, okay, if the goal is to create more questions and answers, how have I done? Another part of the goal is to say, what if where would I be? And how does that affect my ability to connect with people? And how much am I transferring from me to them, where it's, I'm really honing in on or identifying better with my injury, my wound, rather than listening and connecting to theirs. And for me, as long as I'm dealing with my wound, as long as I'm opening up about that, I'm honest about that, I'm better able to be with people in theirs. When I find myself talking too much rather than asking curious questions, I have to go back and say, what is going on in me that has to fix or control this, rather than just be present and be with them.
I have a lot of stuff, like you've stirred up some stuff with me, and I don't know if I can even articulate, but one of the things that I found recently, just, I don't know if it's being in California, if it's my stage of life, it's the whatever, but it feels like the world of people that I'm with, including some of you, are more more comfortable with questioning things and saying we're questioning things than I've ever experienced in my life. And as you're going through this, it makes me wonder if it's just that I am at a stage where I am more open to hearing it than I've ever been, or if in fact, I mean, I do believe our world is changing, and there are a lot of questions, at least in my environment, that I've never had to even deal with people before. So I don't really have anything profound or to say. I just am saying thank you for opening that, kind of laying this out and challenging us to even think about it, Sam. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
When you find the answers, could you give another presentation, please?
It might be in heaven, Ramona, so it might be a long time from now. Well, yeah. I think one of the things I learned in CPE was this is a work that is all around our own work. And we do better with other people when we're dealing with our stuff than if we're not. And there are sometimes we'll come home exhausted and have to say, what just happened? Where is this coming from? And that, what if that is the work? Like, it's not the answers. Hopefully I haven't given too many answers here, but it's actually the question, and doing that in community. And how does that affect our work? And what are the questions this is bringing up for me right now? Like Ramona's saying, we have a community that can handle that. So, good place to be. All right, well, thanks, guys. I'll give you back to your day. And speaking of, this is an intense work. I've got a grief group that I need to go do with some veterans. So off we go.
Thanks, Tim, for pinch hitting, and really all of this was just excellent. Haven't thought about Fowler in quite a while, and interesting to rethink through that again. So thanks.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, this was really great, Tim. It was a great presentation.
appreciate that. Yeah, talk about doing it on the fly.
Well, you did a fabulous job. Well, and it's obvious you know your material and you enjoy talking about it, so that's a real plus too.
You enjoy talking. Yeah. All right, guys.
All right.
We'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
See ya.
Thanks, Tim.
You bet.